The carriage door swings open, and a girl tumbles out onto frozen cobblestones, her hands bleeding, her trunk thrown out behind her by a footman who does not even look back. She is 17 years old. She has just buried her father. And the man standing at the top of those stone steps, her uncle, Lord Gretham, does not reach down to help her. He looks at her the way a merchant looks at something he did not order, but must now find use for. "You will earn your keep," he says, "or you will find the streets far colder than my doorstep." That is how it begins for Aneth Vorley. For 3 years, she scrubs floors that maids should scrub, carries coal that servants should carry, and sits at the far end of every table where no one addresses her by name. Her cousins wear silk. She wears silence. Her uncle collects her father's estate, piece by piece, deed by deed, while she watches and says nothing, because there is no one to say anything to. Until the morning a ducal crest appears on a carriage rolling through the village gates, and everything Lord Gretham has built on her suffering begins to crack. Now, before this story goes any further, tell me this. If you had endured 3 years of cruelty with no one in your corner, what would you do the moment power finally walked through that door? Drop your answer below. Tell us the beautiful part of the world you are watching from. And if stories like this move something in you, subscribe now, because this is only the beginning. The morning Lord Gretham decided Aneth Vorley would serve at his dinner table was the same morning he told his guests she was the daughter of his late cook. She heard it through the kitchen wall. She stood there with a tray of silver spoons in her hands, steam rising from the soup pot beside her, and she listened to her uncle laugh as the lie left his mouth smooth and easy, like he had rehearsed it 100 times. Perhaps he had. Lord Gretham was a man who prepared his cruelties carefully. Aneth set the tray down before she dropped it. 3 years since she had arrived at Gretham Hall with nothing but a trunk, a grief too large to carry, and the legal fact that her uncle was her only living guardian. 3 years since he had looked her over the way a man surveys damage and decided she was worth less than he had hoped. Her father, Sir Aldous Vorley, had been a gentleman of modest but honest means, a good man, a quiet man. He had left Aneth a small inheritance, a name with dignity attached to it, and a letter sealed with his ring that named her the rightful beneficiary of Vorley Cottage and the land it sat on. Lord Gretham had taken the letter. He had taken the ring. He had taken the cottage and the land both, folded them into his own holdings through documents Aneth had been too young and too crushed by grief to understand, and he had never once mentioned them again. What he had given her instead was a room above the scullery, a list of daily duties, and a very clear understanding that gratitude was expected. Aneth had learned to give him the face of gratitude while burying everything else. She carried the soup in. The dining room glittered. Gretham Hall was not a modest house. Her uncle had a talent for spending money that was not originally his, and the result was a room full of candlelight, heavy drapes, and guests who believed they were dining with a man of consequence. There were 8 of them tonight. Lord Gretham at the head, his wife Lady Pruneth beside him, their 2 daughters, Ossie and Favienne, arranged like decorations on either side. Across from them sat a magistrate named Sir Torvin Bleak, his thin wife, and 2 young men Aneth did not recognize. She moved along the table quietly. This was the skill 3 years had sharpened in her most, the art of being present without being seen. "Pour for Mr. Haltwick first," Lady Pruneth murmured, without looking at her. Aneth poured. She kept her eyes low and her movements small. But as she reached the end of the table, one of the young men, the taller one with restless eyes, glanced at her directly and held the look a breath too long. She moved away before it could become anything. Later, in the kitchen, Cook Dara pressed a heel of bread into her hand and said nothing. That was how kindness worked in Gretham Hall. It came without words, in secret, in the spaces between tasks. Aneth ate the bread over the wash basin. Outside, the autumn wind was pushing hard against the windows, and somewhere deep in the house, a door slammed. She heard her uncle's voice rise and then lower, the way it did when he was negotiating something. Lord Gretham was always negotiating something. She did not think much of it that night. She thought of it the next morning, when Aussie appeared in the kitchen doorway with a look on her face that mixed excitement and malice in the particular way that only Aussie could manage. "Father has had a letter," Aussie announced, directing the words at Aneth as though delivering a sentence. "The Duke of Mareth is coming through the county. Father has invited him to stay." Aneth looked up from the potatoes she was scrubbing. "He will need the east wing prepared," Aussie continued. "All of it. Father says you are to oversee it personally. The housekeeper oversees the guest rooms. Mrs. Quelp has a fever. Father says you," Aussie smiled, "better start now. His Grace arrives in 4 days." She left without waiting for a response. Aneth set down the potato brush slowly. A duke. She had never been in the same room as a duke. She was not entirely sure what difference it would make to her particular life, which was already arranged around the needs and moods of people with more power than herself. One more powerful person seemed unlikely to improve things. She dried her hands and went to find the East Wing keys. The East Wing had not been opened in 2 seasons. It smelled of cold, stone, and cedar, and something underneath, both, that she could not name. She moved through it room by room, throwing open shutters, pulling dust covers from furniture, checking for damp and disorder. The rooms were large and well-made, the kind of rooms that reminded her of what Gretham Hall was before her uncle got his hands on it entirely. It had belonged to her grandmother once, her mother's mother. That was a thread of history Lord Gretham preferred no one pull at. On the second day of preparation, a rider arrived with a letter bearing a seal Aneth did not recognize. She was in the east corridor when the butler Perwick brought it through, and she caught a glimpse of the wax impression, an eagle with its wings pressed flat, the Mareth crest. The Duke had changed his arrival date. He would be there in 2 days, not 4. Lord Gretham's mood shifted visibly. He became sharp with the staff in a way that meant he was nervous. Lord Gretham was nervous of very few things, and the fact that a duke unsettled him told Aneth something important, though she could not yet arrange it into meaning. She worked through the night to have the east wing ready. By the time gray light crept through the corridor windows, the rooms were clean, the linens pressed, the fireplaces laid. She had done it with 2 young maids, Tess and Grith, both of whom worked without complaint because Aneth asked rather than ordered, which was more than most people in that house ever offered them. She was standing at the east wing entrance checking the last details when she heard the wheels. The carriage was large. It moved with the certainty of something that had never been asked to hurry for anyone. The horses were dark and well matched, and the coachman sat straight as a post. Behind the carriage came 2 more vehicles and 4 outriders. Aneth stepped back from the window. She had not expected it to feel like anything. But something shifted in the air of the house. Some pressure changed, as though the building itself recognized that whoever was inside that carriage carried a weight that rearranged rooms before he entered them. She went downstairs through the servants' passage and arrived in the kitchen just as the front doors opened above. "Come away from there," Cook Dara said to Tess, who was craning toward the hall. "None of our business." But Aneth stood very still in the middle of the kitchen and listened. She heard her uncle's voice, smooth and eager in a way it never was with anyone else. She heard Lady Pruneth's practiced warmth. She heard Aussie laugh too loudly at something, the way she did when she was trying to impress. And then she heard another voice. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It moved through the house, the way cold water moves, finding every crack and filling it. "Lord Gretham," it said, "your letter mentioned a matter of some local business you wished to discuss. I would prefer to address it before I rest." There was a pause. "Of course, Your Grace," her uncle said. "Of course." Aneth did not know why her hands had gone still. She looked down at them. Whatever Lord Gretham had invited this man here to discuss, it was not hospitality. That much was already clear. She picked up a cloth and began polishing a candle holder that was already clean. and she listened to the footsteps move toward her uncle's study, and she told herself it had nothing to do with her. She told herself that for the rest of the morning. By afternoon, she no longer believed it. The study door did not open for 2 hours. Aneth knew this because she was asked 3 times during those 2 hours to bring things to the door and leave them on the hall table outside. First tea, then a second pot, then a plate of biscuits that came back untouched. Whatever was being discussed inside, it was not going well for at least one of them. When the door finally opened, Lord Gretham emerged first. His face was the particular color it turned when he had lost an argument and not yet found a way to reframe it as a victory. He walked past Aneth without seeing her, which was usual, and disappeared toward the back of the house. The Duke of Merath came out second. Aneth had imagined something imposing and cold, the way dukes were described in the novels Favienne left lying around the drawing room. She had imagined someone designed to make other people feel small. What she had not imagined was someone who stopped in the corridor and looked directly at her. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 past it. He was tall, and there was something in the way he held himself that spoke not of arrogance, but of a man who had long ago stopped needing anyone's approval and had settled into that freedom with some relief. His eyes were a dark, settled gray, and they moved over the hall the way a man reads a room for exits and exits alone. They landed on Aneth. She was still holding the tray from the biscuits. "You have been standing in this corridor for some time," he said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, offered plainly, as if plain speech were simply his natural language. "I was waiting to collect the things from the table, Your Grace," she said. He looked at the untouched biscuits, then back at her. "Did Lord Gretham send you?" "The housekeeper, Your Grace. She is unwell." Something moved in his expression, too brief to name. He glanced toward the direction her uncle had gone, then back. "What is your name?" The question caught her. In 3 years, no guest of Lord Gretham had ever asked her name. She was furniture. She was function. She was the girl with the tray. "Aneth," she said. Then, after a pause that felt like stepping off a ledge, "Aneth Vorley." She watched his face. She did not know what she expected him to do with a name. Dismiss it, most likely. Move on. But the Duke of Merath did not move on. He went very still for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds something happened behind his eyes that she could not read, but could feel, the way you feel weather before it arrives. "Vorley," he repeated. "Yes, Your Grace." He said nothing further. He gave her a short nod, the kind that meant he was filing something rather than finishing it, and then he walked toward the east wing without looking back. Aneth stood in the corridor for a long moment. Then she picked up the tray and went back to the kitchen and told herself firmly that she had imagined the look on his face. She had not imagined it. That evening, Lord Gretham called her to his study. This happened rarely, and never for good reasons. Aneth set down what she was doing and went without rushing, because rushing showed he had rattled her, and she had learned years ago to refuse him that. He was standing behind his desk when she entered. The desk was large and deliberately positioned so that anyone standing before it felt the architecture of authority without it needing to be stated. Lord Gretham understood rooms the same way he understood people, as tools. "You spoke with the Duke," he said. "Not a question." "He spoke to me, uncle," I answered. "What did you tell him?" "My name." Lord Gretham's jaw tightened in a way she recognized. It was the tightening of a man whose careful construction has developed an unexpected crack. "Your name," he repeated. He asked. It would have been rude not to answer. "You are a servant in this house. Rudeness is not a concept that applies to you." Aneth kept her face still. "As you say, uncle." He studied her for a long moment. She had learned to endure his studying. It was the look of a man who was always calculating. In the first year, it frightened her. Now, it simply exhausted her. "The Duke of Meath is here on a matter of business," Lord Gretham said. "He is not here for conversation. You will perform your duties, and you will not seek out his company. You will not speak to him unless directly asked. And if you are directly asked, you will say as little as possible. Do you understand?" "Perfectly," she said. "Good. Go." She went. In the passage outside, she stopped and pressed her back to the wall and breathed carefully. Something was wrong. Not wrong in the everyday way things were wrong in this house, which was constant and expected and dull with repetition. Wrong in a different register. Sharper. Lord Gretham was afraid of what she might say to the Duke. That meant there was something to say. She turned this over in her mind as she walked back to the kitchen, slowly, quietly, thinking. The next morning she found the answer in the last place she expected. Old Perwick, the butler, was not a man given to conversation. He had worked in Gretham Hall longer than her uncle had owned it, which made him the repository of a great deal of information he distributed to no one. But that morning he was unwell himself, moving slowly through the hall with the careful steps of a man whose knees were giving him difficulty, and Aneth took the morning duties from him without being asked. She brought him his breakfast tray. She sat it on the small table in his pantry and was turning to leave when he said, to no one in particular, "Sir Aldous came to this house once to file a deed. I witnessed it myself." Aneth went still. Perwick did not look at her. He looked at his tea. The deed covered Vorley Cottage and the surrounding 12 acres, signed by your father in good faith, filed under Gretham management, pending your majority. He paused. "Your majority was 2 months ago, Miss Vorley." The room was very quiet. "The deed was never transferred," she said. "No," Perwick said. "It was not." He picked up his tea and said nothing else. Aneth walked out of the pantry and down the corridor and through the kitchen and out the back door and stood in the cold morning air for a very long time. 2 months. For 2 months she had been of age. The cottage and the land were legally hers the moment she turned 21, and Lord Gretham had said nothing. He had handed her no documents, offered no accounting, made no mention of the inheritance that her father had left sealed and witnessed and filed. He had simply continued, as if she were still a child, with no standing, as if nothing had changed. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her sides. She thought of her father's ring, the letter sealed with it. She thought of 3 years of coal scuttles and soup trays and sleeping above the scullery while her uncle dined by candlelight on money that traced its roots back to her family. And she thought of the Duke, of those 3 seconds in the corridor, of the way he had said her name. Vorley, as if he recognized it. She went back inside, and this time when she moved through the house, she moved differently. Not faster, not louder, but with something she had not felt in a very long time. She moved with the particular intentionality of a person who has just realized they are not powerless. They are merely uninformed. That afternoon, the Duke of Meath came through the East Wing corridor, where she was relining the wardrobe drawers with fresh paper. He did not look surprised to see her. She was beginning to understand that he was not a man who looked surprised. He stopped at a respectful distance. "Miss Vorley." She had not expected him to use the formal address. She stood and turned. "Your Grace." He looked at the wardrobe, at the paper, at the care with which she had been working. Then he said, quietly, evenly, "I knew your father." The words landed in her chest like something dropped from a height. "He was a good man," the Duke continued. "I was 15 when I met him. He did a service for my family that was never properly repaid." He paused. "I had intended to repay it when he was older, when the time was appropriate." Another pause. "I did not know he had died until 6 weeks ago." Aneth said nothing. She was not sure she could. "I came here on what Lord Gretham described as a matter of local land management." The Duke's voice did not change its temperature, but something underneath it did. It took me approximately 40 minutes of that conversation to understand that the land in question originally belonged to your father. She exhaled slowly. My uncle did not mention that, she said. No, the Duke said. He did not. He looked at her steadily. Are you aware of the contents of your father's estate filings? I became aware this morning, she said, that I was of age, that the transfer was not completed. Amo. Something moved across his face. Not pity. She would have flinched from pity. It was something colder and more useful. It was the expression of a man organizing a response. I see, he said. He stood there another moment, and she had the distinct sense that she was watching something begin, though she could not yet name its shape or know how far it would reach. Continue your work, Miss Vorley, he said. We will speak again. He walked back down the corridor. Aneth turned back to the wardrobe and placed her hands on the drawer edge and held on to it until they stopped shaking. Something had just changed. She was sure of it. She was not yet sure whether to be afraid of it or not. Lord Gretham moved fast when he was cornered. Aneth learned this the following morning when she came downstairs to find two men she had never seen before sitting in the servants' hall, eating breakfast with the easy posture of people who had been invited rather than hired. They were not gentlemen. They were not staff. They occupied a space between the two that made the kitchen maids uneasy enough to stay near the door. Cook Dara pulled Aneth aside by the elbow. Gretham brought them in last night. Late. Berwick doesn't know them. What are they here for? Dara's eyes moved sideways. Watching. That's all I can tell. So, Aneth looked at the two men. One was built like a barn door and ate with his eyes up. The other was thin and pale and had the kind of stillness that was not peace but calculation. She had seen men like them before, not here, but in the village, in the margins of market days, available for the kind of work that respectable people needed done without their names attached. She went about her morning duties and said nothing. But she began paying a different kind of attention. By midday she had noticed three things. The barn doorman was positioned near the east wing entrance every time the Duke was inside it. The thin, pale man had twice walked slowly past the room where Berwick kept the household records. And Lord Gretham had sent Lady Pruneth and both daughters to visit a neighbor that morning, clearing the house of witnesses with the efficiency of someone following a plan. She needed to reach the Duke. The difficulty was that reaching him directly, walking to the east wing, and knocking would be seen. The barn doorman would report it, and Lord Gretham would move against her before the conversation was finished. She thought carefully. Then she went to find Tess. Tess was 16, quiet, and owed Aneth a kindness from the previous winter, when Aneth had taken blame for a broken piece of Lady Pruneth's china rather than see the girl dismissed. Tess listened to 3 sentences of instruction, nodded once, and went to the east wing with a fresh coal scuttle as if it were routine. Inside, while managing the fireplace, she left a folded note beneath the water jug on the Duke's writing table. Aneth had written 4 words. The records room. Tonight. She spent the rest of the day working with her face arranged into the expression of someone who had no plans at all. Lord Gretham watched her at supper service. She could feel it. He sat at his table with his 2 strange men and 2 local acquaintances he had summoned for a dinner that looked social and was not, and he watched her the way a cat watches a mouse it has already decided is trapped. She refilled his wineglass and met his eyes for exactly 1 second and then looked away. After supper she helped clear, helped wash, said good night to Cook Dara, and went upstairs to her room above the scullery. She waited 2 hours. The house settled into its night sounds, creaking timbers, wind at the upper windows, the distant shift of the stable horses. She had memorized the pattern of this house's darkness in her first winter here, when grief had kept her awake most nights, and she had had nothing to do but listen. She moved through it now, without a candle. The records room was off the lower east passage, small and overcrowded with shelving, the kind of room that accumulates paper the way drains accumulate debris. Aneth had been inside it twice. Once to file a laundry inventory, once when Perwick had sent her for an old household ledger. She knew where the estate files were kept. She found the room unlocked, which told her Perwick had been there recently, and possibly intentionally. She slipped inside and pulled the door behind her. She had been there perhaps 4 minutes, working through the files by the narrow beam of a shielded candle, when the door opened. The Duke of Meath came in and closed it quietly behind him. "You found the note," she whispered. "I've found the note," he confirmed. His voice was low and unhurried even now. "You take considerable risks, Miss Vorley. I have been taking risks in this house for 3 years. I am simply taking more deliberate ones. Now." He looked at the files spread before her. She watched him take in the scene and make no comment on it. He crossed to the shelving beside her and ran his fingers along the spines of the bound ledgers with the ease of a man who had navigated records rooms before. "What has he done exactly?" the Duke said. Not a question, more like an invitation for her to confirm what he already suspected. She told him all of it: the cottage, the 12 acres, the deed witnessed by Perwick, the letter sealed with her father's ring, the 2 months since her majority that Lord Gretham had let pass in silence. She told it plainly, without performance, the way she had trained herself to speak in this house, efficiently, without wasted breath, because in Gretham Hall no one listened long enough for anything else. The Duke listened the whole way through. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he lifted one of the ledgers from the shelf and opened it near the back pages and turned it toward her candle. She read the entry. It was dated 14 months ago, a land transfer record, written in a clerk's neat hand, recording the sale of Vorley Cottage and its surrounding acreage to one Lord Gretham of Gretham Hall. The amount listed was £4. The signature at the bottom was her father's name. Her father had been dead for 3 years. The room went very cold. "It is a forgery," the Duke said. "Yes." Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. It was filed through the county record office. Whoever helped him do it had access to official channels. He paused. "The magistrate who dined here last week, Sir Torvin Bleak." She had poured wine for him. She looked at the ledger entry again. £4. Her father's name in someone else's hand. 14 months of false legal standing, built on paper thin enough to destroy. But only if someone with the right authority chose to pull it apart. She looked at the Duke. He was already looking at her. "How much do you know about your father's connection to my family?" he asked. "Nothing. He never spoke of it. He would not have. He was not that kind of man." The Duke closed the ledger carefully. 20 years ago, when I was a boy, my father was in serious financial difficulty. Not publicly known. These things rarely are. Your father was, at the time, a solicitor's clerk, with access to certain documents that, if they had surfaced, would have ended my family's standing permanently. He paused. He destroyed them. Voluntarily. He asked for nothing in return. Aneth stared at him. "My father spent his life as a modest gentleman," she said slowly, "because he chose to. He had the means to leverage what he knew into considerable gain, and he did not." Something in the Duke's voice shifted. "I was 15 when mine told me." He said, "Remember this man's name. One day you will have the chance to make it right." I did. The candle between them burned very quietly. "And then he died before I could find him," the Duke said. "And I arrived here 6 weeks late and found his daughter carrying coal." Aneth pressed her lips together, hard. She would not cry in front of the Duke of Meath. She had not cried in 2 years, and she would not begin now in a records room in the dark. "Lord Gretham knows you suspect the land transfer," she said. "He brought 2 men into the house yesterday. They are watching the east wing." "I know. The larger one has been outside my door since morning." Something in his expression sharpened. "Your uncle is planning to move quickly. He did not invite me here, out of boldness. Someone told him I had begun looking into your father's estate from outside the county, and he decided the safest response was to invite me where he could see me. He wanted to manage you. He wanted to offer me a financial arrangement that would make the land question disappear. He proposed it within the first 20 minutes. A pause. He did not expect me to refuse. Aneth thought of her uncle's face when he came out of that study, the color of a lost argument. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," the Duke said, "I need that ledger out of this house before he destroys it." He looked at her directly. "I cannot remove it myself. My movements are watched more carefully than yours. Within the house, you are invisible to him. That is an advantage." She understood what he was not quite saying. "You need me to take it. I need you to decide if you are willing to," he said. "It is not a small thing. If he discovers it before I have had time to act, he will remove you from this house on any pretext he can construct, and his reach in this county is not inconsiderable." She picked up the ledger. "Tell me where," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense again of something beginning, but clearer now, sharper at the edges, less like weather, and more like a door opening onto a room with light in it. "There is a saddlebag in the third stall from the left in the stable," he said. "My man Croft manages it. He expects a delivery before dawn." She tucked the ledger under her arm. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. She was at the door when he spoke again. "Miss Vorley," she stopped. "Your father would have been proud of you." She left before she could respond to that, because there was nothing she could have said that would not have undone her completely. She reached the stable without being seen, or so she believed. Croft was exactly where the Duke had said, a compact, quiet man who took the ledger from her without a word and placed it into the saddlebag with the practiced ease of someone who had done similar things in similar darkness before. He gave her a single nod. She walked back to the house. She was on the back step when the thin, pale man stepped out of the shadow beside the door. Her heart lurched. She kept her face still. "Late for a walk," he said. "I couldn't sleep. I needed air." She moved to pass him. His hand came out and pressed flat against the doorframe, not touching her but blocking. "What you got under your arm?" She had nothing under her arm. She had left the ledger with Croft, but she was holding her own shawl wrapped around herself against the cold, and in the dark it might have looked like something. "My shawl," she said. She let it fall open, showing him nothing beneath. "Do you require further inspection, or may I go inside?" "Coat." He looked at her for a long moment, with those still, calculating eyes. Then he stepped back. She went in. She made it to the top of the scullery stairs before her legs began to shake. She sat on the top step in the dark and breathed until they stopped. In the morning she discovered that Perwick was gone. Not ill, not delayed, gone. His room cleared, his position vacated, the ring of household keys left on the hall table as neatly as a man who had planned his departure. Cook Dara found them and brought them to Aneth with a look that said everything she would not say aloud. Lord Gretham had moved against Perwick. The old butler had been the only witness to the original deed filing, the only person in the house who could confirm what he had seen 20 years ago and what he had let Aneth understand in that pantry. He knew it too. That was why he had told her when he did, not out of sudden sentiment, but because he had understood the timing. He had given her the information before he lost the ability to. Aneth held the keys and felt the weight of what that man had just sacrificed for her father's memory. She went to Lord Gretham. She did not wait to be summoned. She knocked on his study door and opened it without waiting for an answer, which she had never done before, and the shock of it held him silent for the 3 seconds she needed to speak first. "You dismissed Perwick," she said. Her uncle recovered quickly. He always did. He was stealing from the household accounts. "I have records." "You have forged records. That appears to be a specialty." The room went completely still. Lord Gretham rose from his chair very slowly. He was a large man, built for intimidation, and he used his height now deliberately, coming around the desk, closing the distance between them in a way designed to make her step back. She did not step back. "You will want to be very careful," he said softly, "about what you say next." "I have been careful for 3 years," she said. "It did not return my father's land. His face changed. Not dramatically. Lord Gretham was too controlled for drama. But something moved behind his eyes, something cold and final, and she recognized it for what it was. The moment a man decides to stop managing a problem and start eliminating it. "You have nothing," he said. "You are nothing. A ward with no money, no connections, and no standing in this or any county. Whatever fantasy you have constructed around a duke who spoke 2 sentences to you in a corridor, I would dismantle it. Men like Merath do not concern themselves with servant girls. That is simply not how the world operates." "My father was not a servant," she said, "and I am not a servant girl. I am Aneth Vorley, daughter of Sir Aldous Vorley, and I have been the legal majority for 2 months, while you held property that belongs to me." He smiled. It was the worst thing he could have done at that moment, because it was completely genuine. "Prove it," he said. She left the study. She walked straight and fast, because she could feel him watching, and she would not let him see her waver. But inside her chest, something was hammering hard, because he was not wrong. The ledger was in the saddlebag in the stable. But she did not know if that was enough. She did not know what the Duke planned. She did not know how fast Lord Gretham would move now that the conversation had become explicit. She found out within the hour. Lady Pruneth returned from the neighbor's visit and went directly into her husband's study, and the door did not open for 40 minutes. When it did, Ossie appeared in the kitchen with the particular expression she wore when she was delivering pain dressed as news. "Father is writing to the county magistrate this afternoon," Ossie said. "He says there has been a theft from the household records room. He says you are the most likely suspect." Aneth set down the pot she was holding. "He is also writing to the Vorley solicitor," Ossie continued. And here something flickered in her expression that was not quite the satisfaction she was performing. "Something uncertain, to inform them that you have been found mentally unfit for independent management of any estate. He has a physician prepared to sign a statement." A physician, a magistrate who dined at Gretham Hall. False records filed through official channels, forged signatures, dismissed witnesses. He had built the entire architecture while she was carrying his coal. "Why are you telling me this?" Aneth asked. Ossie blinked. The question had caught her off guard. She had expected tears, or argument, or begging, not a direct question asked in a level voice. Ossie started, then stopped. "Because if you are telling me out of loyalty to your father, then you are doing your duty, and I understand it. But if you are telling me because some part of you knows what he is doing is wrong, then you should know there is still time to say so to someone who matters." Ossie's face did something complicated. She was 20 years old, raised in a house where her father's version of events was the only version permitted, and she had never been offered an alternative arrangement. She stood in the kitchen doorway, and her expression moved through several things quickly, like pages turning. Then she composed herself and left. Aneth did not know what that meant. She filed it and moved on, because there was no time for anything else. She needed to reach the Duke before the letter to the magistrate was sent. She found him in the East Wing library, standing at the window, reading a document she recognized as one of his own. He looked up when she entered without knocking. She told him everything. The physician's statement, the theft accusation, the letter being written at that moment 1 floor below. When she finished, the Duke set down his document. "How long has Gretham known Sir Torvin Bleak?" he asked. "Since before I arrived. They dined together regularly." "And the physician?" "Dr. Kremble. He attends the household. He does whatever my uncle pays him to do." The Duke nodded slowly. He walked to the writing table and sat down and pulled a sheet of paper toward him and began writing with the focused speed of a man who had already prepared what to say and simply needed the right moment to say it. "What are you writing?" she asked. 3 letters. He did not stop writing. One to the Lord Lieutenant of this county, who outranks your uncle, the magistrate, and anyone else Gretham has assembled. One to my own solicitor in London, who will travel here within 48 hours with copies of your father's original estate filing, which I have held in my own records for 20 years because my father told me to keep it safe. She stared at him. Your father kept a copy. He was not a careless man. He turned the page. The third letter is to a colleague who sits on the county land board and has been looking for evidence of record manipulation in this district for some time. It appears I can provide him with an excellent case study. Aneth stood very still. You came here already prepared, she said slowly. You knew before you arrived. He looked up then. I knew the shape of it. I did not know how much you had endured. That I did not know. A pause. I am sorry for it. She looked at this man, this duke she had known for less than 3 days, who had walked into Gretham Hall carrying 20 years of her father's story in his records, and sat across from her uncle without showing a single card. He thinks he has won, she said. He thought he had won before I arrived, the duke said. That was his first error. He folded the first letter, sealed it, and set it aside. His second error, he continued, reaching for a fresh sheet, was dismissing Perwick. Perwick is currently sitting in the inn, at the village, with a written statement, 2 witnesses, and a great deal of patience. He glanced at her briefly. I sent Croft to him last night, directly after you left the stable. The breath went out of her. He had already moved. While she was facing the thin, pale man at the back door, shaking on the scullery stairs, lying awake calculating her diminishing options, he had already moved. She did not know whether to feel relieved or furious that she had been frightened at all. You might have told me, she said. You were already carrying enough, he said simply. She could not argue with that. He sealed the second letter. Outside the window, the afternoon was graying toward early dusk, and somewhere in the house, a clock struck 4, and Lord Gretham was 1 floor below, writing a letter to a magistrate who was about to discover that the Duke of Meath had reached the Lord Lieutenant first. What do I do now? She asked. He looked at her steadily. Now, you go about your evening as though nothing has changed. You perform every duty. You give your uncle no reason to accelerate his plans tonight. Can you do that? I have been doing that for 3 years, she said. Something moved across his face, brief and honest, and unguarded in a way that told her it was real. Not for much longer, he said. The evening meal was the longest 2 hours of Aneth's life. She moved through the dining room with the tray, the wine, the bread, the soup, the remove, the dessert, each course delivered with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times and felt nothing. She kept her eyes low and her breathing even, and she counted the minutes the way a person counts steps across ice, one at a time, without looking at how far there was still to go. Lord Gretham was in fine spirits. That was the thing that made it hardest. He sat at the head of his table with the satisfaction of a man who had spent the afternoon constructing a cage and was now simply waiting for morning to show it to its occupant. He poured his own wine twice without asking her, which meant he was comfortable. He laughed at things his acquaintances said. He cut his meat with the long, easy strokes of someone whose hands were not shaking at all. Dr. Kremble was at the table. She had not expected that. He was a narrow man, with spectacles that sat too low on his nose, and the habit of agreeing with whoever held the most power in the room. He had attended Aneth once in her first winter at Gretham Hall, when a fever had kept her in bed for a week. He had given her a tincture and told her uncle she was constitutionally fragile. She had understood even then that constitutionally fragile meant useful, that it was a description kept ready for deployment. Now she understood exactly when it would be deployed. She refilled his glass without looking at him, and he did not look at her, and they existed in the same room the way 2 people exist who have entirely different ideas about what the next morning will bring. Ossie was quiet throughout the meal. Aneth noticed it because Ossie was rarely quiet. She talked at tables the way some people breathed, continuously and without particular intent. But tonight she moved her food around her plate and answered questions in short sentences, and twice looked at Aneth with an expression that lasted only a moment before she looked away again. Fabienne, the younger daughter, noticed nothing. She was 17 and entirely absorbed in a conversation about a ball being held in the next county, which she addressed to the room at large with the confidence of someone who expected the room to be equally absorbed. Lady Pruneth watched her husband. That was what she did at table. Aneth had observed it for 3 years. Lady Pruneth was not a stupid woman. She was a woman who had made a calculation early in her marriage and committed to it entirely, and the calculation was this: her husband's success was her success, and questioning it was a form of personal destruction she was not willing to attempt. So she watched him the way a sailor watches the sky, reading his moods, adjusting accordingly, contributing when contribution was safe, and going silent when it was not. Tonight she was very silent. After the meal, Aneth cleared and washed and dried and put away and said goodnight to Cook Dara and went upstairs. She lay on her bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house. At 10:30, she heard Lord Gretham's study door close. At 11, she heard it open, and footsteps cross the hall, and the front door open and close. She went to her small window. Below, in the thin moonlight, the barn door man was walking down the drive toward the village with the speed of someone on an errand. A letter being delivered. She had perhaps until morning. She stayed where she was. She had her instructions, and she intended to follow them, not because she was accustomed to following instructions, but because, for the first time in 3 years, the instructions came from someone whose motives she trusted. She thought about that, about trust, about how quickly it had formed, and whether that made it fragile or simply honest. She thought about her father, about the kind of man who destroys documents that could make him rich and asks for nothing and raises a daughter alone and dies before she is old enough to understand the full shape of what he was. She thought about the Duke holding that story for 20 years. At 11:30, a small stone struck her window. She was downstairs and out the back door in 90 seconds. Croft was in the shadow of the kitchen garden wall. Beside him, wrapped in a traveling coat and carrying a leather case, was a man she had not seen before. Older, gray at the temples, with the brisk, organized energy of someone who had ridden through the night on purpose and felt no particular inconvenience about it. "Miss Vorley," Croft said quietly, "this is Mr. Sable, His Grace's solicitor." Mr. Sable opened his leather case without preamble. "I have here a certified copy of your father's original estate filing, notarized in London and witnessed by 2 members of the county bar. I have a sworn statement from a Mr. Perwick, former butler of this household, attesting to the circumstances of the original deed and the identity of those present." He looked at her over the case. "I also have a letter from the Lord Lieutenant of this county, directed to Lord Gretham, informing him that his recent filing regarding the Vorley land transfer is under formal review and that no further legal instruments related to that estate may be executed pending investigation." Aneth pressed her hand flat against the garden wall. "When does Gretham receive it?" she asked. "It will be delivered at 8 tomorrow morning by the Lord Lieutenant's own man." Mr. Sable closed the case with a decisive click. "However, there is a complication." Of course there was. "The physician's statement was filed this afternoon, not tomorrow, as your uncle intended. It was filed at 4 o'clock at the county record office by Dr. Kremble in person." Mr. Sable looked at her steadily, "which means that as of this afternoon, there is an official document in the county records declaring you mentally unfit for estate management." The cold of the garden became a different kind of cold. "Can it be challenged?" she asked. "It can. It will be. But it takes time, and your uncle knows that. He filed early precisely because a challenge takes time." Sable paused. "He is attempting to delay the transfer long enough to make the estate legally complicated. Even if the forgery is exposed, a contested mental fitness filing can tie up a land transfer for months, years, in some cases." Aneth thought about this carefully. "He needs the magistrate." "Yes." and the magistrate needs to believe the physician's statement is legitimate. Correct. What if the magistrate had reason to doubt Dr. Krembel's integrity before he acts on it? Mr. Sable looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. That would be helpful, he said. Dr. Krembel dines at Gretham Hall regularly, she said. He has signed household documents before. There is a record in the household files of payments made to him that go beyond his medical fees. I have seen the ledger entries myself during the preparation of the household accounts. She paused. If those entries were presented to the magistrate before he acts on the physician's statement, he would need to consider whether the statement was independent professional opinion or a paid service. Croft and Mr. Sable exchanged a look. The ledger entries, Sable said carefully. Are they accessible? The records room is unlocked, she said. Herwick saw to that. Sable looked at her for a long moment. Miss Vorley, I begin to understand why His Grace spoke of you the way he did. She did not ask what way that was. She showed Sable where to go, waited at the passage corner while he went in, and came back out 11 minutes later with 2 pages of copied entries, the originals left untouched and undisturbed. Then she went back upstairs and lay on her bed, and this time she did not stare at the ceiling. She slept. Deeply, completely, for the first time in 3 years, without something coiled in her chest. She simply slept. She woke to shouting, not the controlled, cold anger of Lord Gretham at his most dangerous, actual shouting. The kind that meant control had already failed, and what was left was just noise. She dressed and went downstairs. The entrance hall was full of people. The Lord Lieutenant's man stood at the door with the particular expression of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome documents and entirely unbothered by the reception. Lord Gretham stood in his morning coat with a letter in his hand, and his face a color she had never seen on it before. Lady Pruneth was on the stairs, motionless. Aussie stood beside her mother with both hands pressed flat against her skirts. Fabienne was eating a piece of toast in the drawing-room doorway and watching with open fascination. The Duke of Merath stood to the left of the hall, near the corridor entrance, fully dressed, composed, and utterly still in the way of a man who has arranged a room and is now simply watching it perform. He saw Aneth on the lower stair. He said nothing. But something in his stillness acknowledged her, a small shift, the way a door opens just enough to let light through. Lord Gretham saw her a moment later. You, he said. The word came out, stripped of all the layers he usually packed around it. No smoothness, no management, just the bare thing underneath. Lord Gretham, the Lord Lieutenant's man, said firmly, the letter requires your signature of receipt, not your commentary. She has conspired against me in my own house. You have defrauded her in your own house, the Duke said. The hall went completely silent. Lord Gretham turned toward the Duke with the slow deliberateness of a man who is recalculating every assumption he made in the past 72 hours and finding each one wrong. You came here under the pretense of a business arrangement, he said. You misrepresented your intentions. You invited me here to buy my silence, the Duke said. I misrepresented nothing. I simply declined your offer and pursued the truth instead, which is not misrepresentation. It is character. Something broke in Lord Gretham's face then, not dramatically. It was a quiet breaking, the kind that happens to structures when the central support finally gives. He looked older. He looked like what he was, a man who had built everything on borrowed ground and had always known, underneath the confidence, that it would not hold. He looked at Aneth. She looked back at him. She kept her face still and her hands loose at her sides, and she gave him nothing, not anger, not triumph, not pity. She gave him the same silence she had perfected over 3 years in his house, except that now it was hers by choice instead of necessity, and that made it an entirely different thing. He looked away first. Mr. Sable presented the documentation at the county record office at 9 that morning. Aneth was not there. She remained at Gretham Hall, because leaving would have felt like running, and she had not run from anything in this house in 3 years, and she did not intend to begin on the day it ended. She sat in the kitchen with cook Dara and drank tea and did not speak much, and Dara did not require her to, which was why Dara had been the closest thing to family she had found inside these walls. Tess came in at 9:30 with wide eyes and reported that the magistrate, Sir Torvin Bleak, had been summoned to the Lord Lieutenant's office and had arrived looking uncomfortable and left looking worse. The ledger entries showing payments to Dr. Kremble had done precisely what Aneth had hoped. Bleak was a corrupt man but not a brave one, and when the Lord Lieutenant placed the evidence before him, the calculation shifted instantly. A corrupt magistrate who turns cooperative is treated differently than one who does not. He turned cooperative within 20 minutes. Dr. Kremble's statement was formally withdrawn by midday. By early afternoon, 2 things happened at once. The forgery case was referred to the county court with the Lord Lieutenant's endorsement and the ledger as primary evidence, supported by Perwick's sworn statement and the certified copy of the original estate filing. And Vorley Cottage and its 12 acres were placed under a protective legal order preventing any transaction until the matter was fully resolved. It was not yet hers in her hands, but it was no longer his. Aneth was in the East Wing corridor when Croft brought her the news. She stood very still after he delivered it, and he waited, understanding without being told that she needed a moment. And then she nodded, and he went. She pressed her palm against the cold stone wall of the corridor. 12 acres. A cottage. Her father's ring was still gone. The letter still burned or buried or destroyed somewhere in this house. And those losses were permanent. In a way, the land was not. But the land was what her father had worked to protect for her, what he had sealed and witnessed and filed, what he had believed a guardian and a legal system would honor in his absence. She was honoring it for him now. She heard footsteps. Not Croft, not a maid. She knew these footsteps already. 3 days was apparently enough for that. And she turned before the Duke came around the corridor corner. He stopped a few feet away. "You have heard," he said. Just now. He studied her face with the same directness he had brought to everything. Not invasive, but honest. The look of a man who did not bother with the performance of not looking. "You are not celebrating," he observed. "I do not know how to yet," she said. "I have spent 3 years learning how to endure. Celebration is a different skill. I expect it will come." By. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something quieter. "It will," he said. She looked at him. This man who had walked into Gretham Hall carrying her father's story and 20 years of a debt honored at exactly the right moment. "Why did you not simply send your solicitor?" she asked. "You could have handled it entirely from outside. You did not need to come yourself." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I did not need to." She waited. "My father told me, remember this man's name. One day, you will have the chance to make it right." He paused. Making it right from a distance did not seem like making it right. She understood that completely. She was the daughter of a man who could have profited from someone else's difficulty and chose not to, and she understood to her bones the difference between doing the minimum that honor required and actually showing up. "Thank you," she said. The words were not enough. She knew that, but they were honest, and she had found that honest words, even insufficient ones, were better than elaborate ones that were not. He nodded. Then, after a pause, "What will you do when it is settled?" She had thought about this in small, careful pieces over the past 3 days, not daring to think about it fully until it was real enough to hold. "Go home," she said. "Vorley Cottage needs work. 12 acres needs attention. I know nothing about managing land, but I am a quick study, and I have spent 3 years learning how to do things I was not taught, so I expect this will be similar." She paused. "I would like to bring cook Dara if she is willing. And Tess." "And Perwick?" he said. "Perwick most of all," she said. "He is owed a great deal." The Duke looked at her for a moment, with that same quiet, honest expression. I will have Mr. Sable ensure the resolution is expedited. These matters can be drawn out deliberately if left unattended. I will not leave it unattended. You have already done more than the debt required, she said. The debt, he said, has nothing to do with it now. The words settled between them in the corridor, unhurried. She did not look away from him, and he did not look away from her. And nothing was said that should not have been said, and everything that needed to be understood was understood without saying, which was its own kind of language, one she had not known she was capable of until 3 days ago. Then footsteps came from the far end of the corridor, and the moment ended cleanly, the way good things end, not broken but simply complete. It was Aussie. She stopped when she saw them both. Her expression went through several rapid adjustments. Then she fixed her eyes on Aneth and walked forward with something that cost her visibly, but that she paid anyway. I want you to know, Aussie said, stopping 3 feet away, that I did not know about the forgery, the land transfer. I knew Father managed things in ways that were not always. She stopped. And, Aussie started again. I knew it was not right, what you were made to do here. I told myself it was not my concern. Aneth waited. I am sorry, Aussie said, stiff and imperfect and real. That is all. I am sorry. It was not enough to cover 3 years. Aneth knew that, and she thought Aussie knew it too, and she respected the fact that Aussie had not tried to make it sound like it was. I know, Aneth said simply. Aussie nodded and left quickly, which was probably the wisest thing she had done in the entire duration of their acquaintance. The Duke looked at Aneth after she was gone. That was generous, he said. That was practical, Aneth said. She is going to have to live in this county after her father's case is concluded. It is better for everyone if she has chosen the right side before the verdict. He looked at her with that almost smile again. You think very clearly for someone who has just had an extremely turbulent 72 hours. 3 years of turbulence is excellent preparation, she said. Lord Gretham left Gretham Hall that afternoon. Not permanently. Not yet. The legal process would take its course, and he would have his opportunity to answer for it, and the outcome was not in question. Not with the Lord Lieutenant's office involved, and the evidence already documented, and the magistrate already cooperative. But he left the hall and went to the county town, and the house felt different the moment his carriage rolled out of the gate. Lighter. Not happier. Not healed. Houses that have held cruelty for years do not simply release it when the source departs, but lighter, as though the walls had been holding their breath and could now let it go. Aneth stood at the front door and watched the carriage until it was out of sight. Lady Pruneth remained. She sat in the drawing room with her hands in her lap and said nothing to anyone, which was perhaps the most honest she had ever been. Fabienne ate more toast. These were not Aneth's problems to solve. She had solved the only problem that was hers. She went to find cook Dara. Dara was at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug, looking out the small window at the kitchen garden. She looked up when Aneth came in. Aneth sat across from her and told her everything, beginning to end, all of it, every piece she had not been able to say before. Dara listened without interrupting. When Aneth finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Vorley Cottage. How big is the kitchen? Aneth laughed. It came out sudden and real, and a little rough at the edges from disuse, and it surprised her so much she pressed her hand over her mouth, and Dara looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to maternal she had encountered in 3 years, and neither of them said anything further because nothing further was needed. 2 days later, Mr. Sable returned with the preliminary resolution. The protective order was confirmed. The forgery case was formally opened. Perwick's statement was entered into the official record. And Aneth Vorley, daughter of Sir Aldous Vorley, was formally recognized as the legal heir to Vorley Cottage and its surrounding 12 acres, pending final court confirmation, which Mr. Sable estimated would take 6 weeks. 6 weeks. After 3 years, 6 weeks was nothing. The Duke came to find her in the East Wing, where she was removing the last of the fresh linens she had installed for his stay, folding them back into the press with the same careful hands that had laid them out 4 days ago in a completely different life. "I leave tomorrow morning," he said. She had known this was coming and had decided in advance not to feel it as a loss, because it was not a loss. It was simply a conclusion, and conclusions were not the same as endings. "Safe journey, Your Grace," she said. "I will have Sable write to you weekly until the confirmation is through," he said. "If any difficulty arises, any attempt by Gretham to interfere or delay, you are to write to me directly, and I will respond within the day." "That is not necessary." "It is not necessary," he agreed. "I will do it regardless." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Your father raised someone remarkable," he said. "I want you to know that I see it, not as a courtesy, as a fact." She held his gaze and felt the words settle somewhere deep, in the place where she had kept everything she was not allowed to be for 3 years, and she let them stay there. "Your father raised someone honorable," she said. "I want you to know I see that too." He inclined his head. She inclined hers. It was a formal gesture between two people for whom formality had become, in 4 extraordinary days, its own kind of intimacy. He left the East Wing. She finished folding the linens. In the morning she was in the kitchen when she heard the carriage. She did not go to the window. She listened to the wheels cross the gravel, heard them reach the gate, heard them pass through, heard the sound grow smaller and then disappear. She poured herself tea. Dara came in from the garden with a bunch of late herbs and set them on the table and looked at Aneth with eyes that asked a question without asking it. 6 weeks, Aneth said. Dara nodded and started tying the herbs. 6 weeks to the cottage. 6 weeks to the land her father left her. 6 weeks to a door she could open and close herself, a fire she lit for herself, a morning she owed to no one. She wrapped her hands around the teacup and felt the warmth move through her palms. Outside the kitchen window, the autumn light was doing something extraordinary to the garden. That particular slanted gold that only appears when the season is turning, when one thing is genuinely ending and something else, unnamed as yet, is preparing to begin. She sat with it. She had earned the right to sit with it. And for the first time in 3 years, the silence around her was not the silence of erasure. It was the silence of someone who had endured the worst a house could offer, had stood inside it without breaking, had reached the other side, not because someone had rescued her, but because she had understood, at exactly the right moment, that she was worth rescuing. The rest was simply what followed.